Villains come and go, but only a few seem to stand out to comic book fans as being truly iconic. The wild thing though is even those who seemingly love to see battle against our favorite villains aren't always around to make them rue the day. Welcome back, Nerd Squad. It's me, Amanda McKnight, aka VampX13, but you can call me Vampy, and this is the top 10 most popular villains you forgot about. Let me know which villains you think are somehow still underrated. Number 10, Deacon Frost. Deacon Frost is iconic due to his attachment to Blade, and I feel like a lot of people don't just forget about him, but by extension forget about Blade, which is why they forget about Deacon. I mean, it doesn't help that Deacon has kind of been dead in the comics for a few years now. But while you might have expected him to die in a Blade comic, we couldn't even give him that. Instead, he died in Falcon's comic, although at least, Blade was there. Blade was also in the comic. Deacon met his end in 2018 in Falcon issue number 8 from the second volume of the Falcon series. Fortunately, with us on our way to getting a new Blade feature film, there is a good chance Deacon Frost will see a resurgence of some sort. I don't know if we'll see him again in the comics, but odds are at least good we'll see a version of him once more on the big screen. And friends, before I move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, and if you love when I get to talk about villains, I know I love it, be sure to head on over to our villains playlist to check out even more good evil content. Number 9, Giganta. Giganta, for those who are unfamiliar, is a Wonder Woman villain. Why do we love her? Well, she's a giant ginger for starters, so I mean, that's pretty cool. But she also is a complex character. The first version of her to appear was actually just a giant ape who was genetically altered to be a human. I'm not kidding, that is really the story that we had originally for her. She first appeared in Wonder Woman issue number 8 back in the 1940s. That is how classic she is. However, from there, she'd get a less goofy backstory, but her character would always be somewhat goofy because she's still an evil genius thief, which is what I honestly like about her. I personally love when my supervillains and superheroes have an element of oddball fantasy to them, but I still want them to be somewhat grounded, This is comics after all, and sometimes comics are kind of ridiculous. You can be ridiculous, but you can still have something to say as well. And that's what I love about villains like Giganta. Sadly, she doesn't get featured and remembered as much as you'd expect for someone who is literally a big deal. Number 8, Moonstone. Moonstone is one of those villains who I feel hasn't come up in a long time. Is she dead? I checked, and apparently, no, she's not. Moonstone was initially a major Captain Marvel villain from the days back when Carol was known as Miss Marvel, and I actually really love her as a villain for Carol. Captain Marvel doesn't necessarily have some of the strongest villains in comics, so I personally would love to see a return of Karla Sofin's Moonstone in the near future. Maybe we'll see her at some point in the new Captain Marvel series that just launched. Who knows? Number 7, Taskmaster. Taskmaster is one villain who I feel like doesn't usually get enough love in the comics. The only time I see his fans emerging to proudly show their love and appreciate him is when Tony Masters becomes a different person entirely, like in his MCU appearance. Which, to be real with you, I actually didn't hate myself, but I know some people who were pretty perturbed by this because they were truly big Tony Masters fans. And when they explained to me some of the stuff they loved about him, including how sometimes goofy yet also badass he can be, I was genuinely moved. Tony Masters might not be my favorite villain in the comics, but he's definitely got a lot of passionate fans out there who notice whenever he's absent or whenever he's being underwritten in terms of his capabilities. Number 6, Mr. Sinister. Mr. Sinister is one of those villains that I personally have loved, and I know a lot of other people also have loved, but because he's so goofy, he doesn't usually get enough love. Enough coverage, I should say, in the comics. We don't talk about him as much as we should. I know he's ridiculous, but that's what makes him great. There are still many out there who are more casual fans who don't even pay him a thought. They might not even know who Mr. Sinister is, and if that's you, welcome on in, that's totally fine. And yet, among those of comic book and even animated X-Men fans, Sinister has always been one of the most intimidating and sometimes most fun villains. Sure, he did recently get his Sins of Sinister event in the comics, I'll give him that, which although right now I'm taking a year where I'm not staying as up to date with or collecting physically as much of the big two, I constantly heard great things about, and I cannot wait to give it a full read. But at the same time, this felt also like a resurgence of Sinister, this era, this Krakoan era, which we're now coming to an end of. Ever since Hellions, I feel like Sinister was on the up and up, but even now, where is he? What is he doing? It's very likely that once again he'll fall by the wayside and be forgotten, especially with him being in the pit, until someone else is ready once more to realize just how cool he is and bring him back into prominence again. Number 5, Shadow King. Remember when Shadow King was all the rage in the comics? Okay, so I don't know if he was ever really all the rage, but there was a time when he was considered to be one of the most fearsome villains that we had for the X-Men, and I remember it. Or at least, I remember it through reading about it when it happened. I wasn't actually alive when Shadow King first appeared, and I was only pretty little when he terrorized the X-Men as one of their star villains. But I've experienced the fear through going back and reading some of those older comics. You know me, I love 90s comics even though they're ridiculous. Shadow King hasn't been forgotten entirely today. He's still around, but he's just not quite as intimidating and fearsome as he once was during the era of stories such as, the Muir Island Saga or the Psy War. Number 4, Catwoman. So I know what you're going to say. Amanda, how dare you imply that I forgot Catwoman? I would never. Yeah, I figured you might say that. But I'm not talking about forgetting Catwoman straight up in regards to this point, so hold those horses. I'm talking about forgetting where she came from. I feel like in modern comics, Selina is so often portrayed as an anti-hero, and even at times just a straight-up hero, that we forget her origin and her role as a villain. Even with her returning to the role of world's greatest criminal and training other criminals, she's got an altruistic angle here, I'd say. Although I do love that oftentimes this means her stories are far more focused on, what really makes a person bad. It's an interesting question to pose, and I love when we explore it in the comics, but still the fact remains that Catwoman as a crook, for the sake of just thieving, hasn't been a thing for quite some time, and I don't see her returning to that level of thief or criminal really anytime soon. As time goes on, I imagine most readers will continue to forget more and more just what Catwoman was once capable of and how dangerous she once dared to be. Number 3, Brother Blood. Brother Blood is just one of those villains who I think is so underrated. I mean, now we're getting to see more of him in Titans with him returning there, but ever since I found out about him, I wondered why he wasn't around more. After all, this is a villain who is basically kind of a necromancer, or not really a necromancer, maybe a powerful hemomancer. The fact that Brother Blood can basically take control of any superhero he manages to get the blood of makes him not only insanely powerful, but also honestly quite terrifying. I personally have a fear of possession, and the fact that it is something which Brother Blood is capable of and relatively easily can do to someone, even someone as powerful as Superman, let's say, well, it's my most sincere kind of frightening. Number 2, Violator. Violator is another one of those villains who just pops up every now and then, making us remember just how cool and terrifying he is. For me, I first fell in love with the horrifying reality of this villain when I saw the Spawn movie for the first time back in the late 90s, and the Violator was always a character that just stuck out to me. That was the film that, although I wasn't aware of it at the time, probably also made me into a major John Leguizamo fan. And to this day, honestly, I still am. Violator for me is like pure fear incarnate. His appearance, his motives, his downright despicableness. I just think he's so iconic as a villain, which is why it's surprising that he tends to come and go in Spawn comics like the changing of the tide. Number 1, Black Manta. Seriously, I am so psyched for Black Manta in Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. In fact, I might be more psyched for Black Manta's return than I am for Aquaman. Sorry, Arthur. Black Manta is just one of those villains who is so interesting in that you kind of feel like, honestly, he's justified. I mean, maybe not all of his extreme actions, the actions themselves are justified, but his grudge feels personal in a way that you can sympathize with his own loss and his own pain. And honestly, that's what I love about him. It also makes him pretty brutal, but you can understand why he himself can excuse that behavior. That doesn't mean it deserves to be excused, but it does make him a pretty intimidating foe for Aquaman because he's so darn committed and willful, and sometimes he's kind of right. It also means that on the rare occasion when he chooses to ally himself with Arthur, he's often a powerful and equally intimidating ally. That's about it. Until next time, you stay nerdy, YouTube.